Welcome back to another episode of Novelio. Today is Tuesday, May 25th, 2021. I'm going to continue on with my reading of Hot Winter Sun by Jessica Russell. And I'm just going to go back and reread a section that I was reading the last episode. So here we go. The next day, Rose sought out Catherine to tell her she had a visitor. She thanked her and quickly made her way to the parlor, wondering who would be calling at that time of the day. She was completely unprepared to see Christopher standing there, smiling broadly, and she threw herself into his arms. "I told that pleasant maid to say you had a caller. I wanted you to be surprised, and apparently she did, as I asked," he said mischievously. "I cannot believe it's you standing here." He was horrified to hear the story of Robert's death and how she traveled to France only to find their aunt was dead, and of her own subsequent illness. "But I wrote to you last year, Kathy, several times," and suddenly Catherine heard a noise and turned to see Julian, who had just entered the room. "You are home," she cried. "Julian, this is Christopher. He's just arrived from London." "I'll have to explain." She was smiling so beautifully at him that he felt his heart was being crushed as he stood there. Christopher offered his hand, but Julian stared at him without moving. The name escaped him entirely, and he could only think how attractive the young man was, for he immediately recognized him as the one he had seen in the woods with Catherine on that long-ago day before all their lives were shattered. "At last you have come to take her away, then? This is what I feared. Whatever it is between you two has been over for some time, hasn't it? So why not leave her here with us? Her child is the heir to Briarwood. What of that?" "Kathy," Christopher said, looking at her in complete bewilderment, "I apologize for my brother-in-law, Christopher. He makes sport of assigning false motives to people. Thinking the worst of me was his favorite pastime, and apparently still is on occasion." She turned to Julian and finished with, "all while insisting he loves me." Julian began to speak, but she quickly silenced him. "Julian, I would like you to meet my brother, Christopher. Now I think I will leave you two to get better acquainted while I go find Jennifer. She is my sister-in-law," she said to Christopher, and then turning again to Julian said, "and far better at character judgment." With that she went out and closed the door behind her with a definite click that was far more effective than if she had slammed it in anger. Julian suddenly saw Christopher's face fall into the familiar lines of the Trefellners' outstanding good looks, and inwardly shook his head at his ridiculous mistake. To his surprise, Christopher began to laugh when Catherine closed the door. "Well, friend, if it's one thing I know, it's my sister, and she has left you to entertain me to purposely cause you discomfort. She can be quick to retaliate when the mood strikes. Thankfully, it doesn't strike very often. Do you anger her much this way?" he asked, still smiling. "Much," replied Julian dryly, "and I appreciate the fact that you can address me as friend after my tirade." The two sat down as they continued to speaking. "I always find such situations amusing rather than something at which to take offense. You'll find I'm much like her in that respect. We both laugh heartily at this world and prefer to avoid conflict. But I will tell you something. She wants you to have a good opinion of her. It would not have angered her so to find that you believed me an old lover. And that I do, but my heart would have been broken if you were someone come to take her from me. I shouldn't survive it," he added as Luce came in with the brandy. When she left, Julian said, "Any day could be the end with her. As I said, there has been much I've done to anger her this past year. I admit my intentions are to marry her, but as far as her intentions, who can tell?" The men laughed, and Julian went on. "Why did she not go to you after Robert's death?" "She didn't know where I was. If she had, she would not have come to death's door. I sent correspondence here as soon as she was married, but apparently it never arrived. Ironically, in one of them I told her our aunt had died. She would never have set out if it had arrived. Oh well, what's done is done. I should have been better at sending messages all along, but I'm afraid I wasn't. I wished to avoid bringing her into any intrigue, so I wrote as little as possible. Her husband, young as you, of course, it would not have occurred to me that she would be in need. His death was a tragedy for which I am obviously sorry for you both." "Thank you. It was particularly sad as they have never been able to solve it. I thought we would reach old age together. There are days I still cannot believe he is gone. I did try to make Catherine stay after his death, but we did not get on well at first, which was my fault entirely. I pleaded with her in the end. However, she was determined to go. Devil or angels would not have stopped her. Although Julian was engaged in the conversation, through it all there was an undercurrent in his consciousness. More messages, I'm to believe, disintegrated into the thin air? There could no longer be any doubt that someone was behind it, and for a specific reason. The two men sat sipping brandy and watching the fading light, and suddenly Julian said, "May I tell you something that's been on my mind?" "Of course," Christopher replied. "Two things I cannot quite understand. For one, it appears that a message supposedly came from your Aunt Magdalene. However, we now know that she died almost a year previous." "How does a message come from a dead woman?" Christopher said with a baffled expression. He assumed, as Julian once had, that Catherine had just set out to go. "That is almost word for word how I put it to a detective recently. I can't understand such a gross mistake myself. It greatly disturbs me to think that someone was trying to lure her there and perhaps just missed her when she arrived. It makes no sense, unless it was an extravagant prank," Christopher said at length, "although I confess I do not know who would mastermind it. Now I learn of your letters that were assumed lost in the post. I don't want to alarm Catherine, but I doubt they were lost, and Matthew and Clarissa were under the impression that Catherine left no word for them before departing for France. I know she sent a message to the cottage because I discovered that my own stepsister, Clarissa, took care of it for her. Now that perhaps was only your father's interference. I could easily believe so, but there has to be something sinister behind the others." "We shall have to discover what," Christopher said. Christopher had gone to the kitchens to tell Gregory and Esther that her brother had arrived and to make that night's supper particularly special. She saw Sarah on the way back and was not surprised to find that she already knew there was a gentleman caller. "When Rose told me a handsome young man had arrived asking for you, I supposed that perhaps an old romantic interest had sought you out." Sarah looked at her inquisitively, and it annoyed Catherine. She replied coolly that it was her brother, and she wanted everything to be perfect that night. "Yes, certainly." Sarah immediately dropped back to her less familiar attitude toward Catherine, always realizing when she had offended her with a bit too much familiarity. Catherine found the girl somewhat maddening. She enjoyed speaking to her as a friend rather than taking a high-handed approach, as she observed some did with servants, particularly Clarissa. But inevitably, Sarah always seemed to cross the line and say something impertinent. Esther, who had overheard Sarah, turned to Catherine, clicking her tongue. "I have often said that girl is a busybody and a gossip, but since Robert was too good-natured to reprimand servants very often, and Julian essentially could care less, she's gotten a bit out of hand the past few years. I think gossipers should be dismissed." "Well," Catherine replied, "if we were to dismiss servants for a bit of gossip, we'd likely have to dismiss them all." And Esther ultimately agreed. Later, after enjoying a long chat with Christopher and spilling out her deepest thoughts and fears regarding Julian, Catherine spontaneously decided to gather a few of her special roses for the table centerpiece that night and found herself face to face with him in the courtyard. She had not seen him since his outlandish reaction to Christopher's presence in the parlor that morning. "Will you ever forgive me, Kathy?" he asked, giving her his most charming smile. "I haven't decided yet," she said, pulling away from his embrace, but not before he saw her trying to hide a smile of her own. "I think I shall kiss you right here in broad daylight," he said, and at this she could no longer hold her laughter back. "Ah, you could not still be angry if you could laugh so quickly," he said, triumphantly pulling her back into his arms. "You are an impossible person, Julian," she said, trying to whip up anger she no longer felt. "Agreed. Well, it's nothing to be proud of," she said indignantly. "You should at least let me explain, sweetheart. I saw you on that long-ago day meeting Christopher in the woods, and even my own sister told me I was being nothing less than paranoid, but I still believed perhaps he was an old light of love come to take you from me." "So that was the source of your monstrous accusation that I was involved with a lover. I think I shall return to my former state of mind and hate you forever." "Yet you smile a bit when you say that," said Julian. "You can't help but forgive me, because despite what you say, you do care for me, Kat. How am I lucky enough to even have you in my arms at this moment when every man in Cornwall wants you?" It was true that men from all around the area were desperately trying to place themselves first in line for a proposal. A suitable time had now elapsed since Robert's death. One day Julian had remarked about it to Paul, and the latter had laughingly said, "Aye, and I would be one of them if I didn't think you'd do me harm." "Well, your luck is about to run out," Catherine said, as I hear footsteps. She untangled herself from his arms and turned toward the courtyard. "I have to find Matthew and Clarissa, anyway." Passing Christopher on her way in, she said, "That man is impossible. Maybe you can teach him some manners while you are here." "I fear I have come at an inopportune time," Christopher said jocularly as he walked up to Julian. "I just got settled and received the most cordial welcome from Clarissa and Jennifer." He was amused to see that Julian was not paying very much attention and knew well the reason. "I shall never be correct with your sister," he exclaimed without ceremony, as Christopher and Julian had somehow managed to bypass all formality from almost the first meeting. Julian did not yet know that this was because he found the man so similar in personality to the twin he had lost. "I can almost feel my brother laughing at me sometimes up there with his maker, wondering what on earth I think I'm doing to presume I could ever win over a woman such as she. He was the better man, Christopher, make no mistake about it. I'm sorry she is left with me, who is merely a pale reflection of the one she really needed." "Methinks you're a bit hard on yourself, Julian. You certainly have enough knowledge of women in this world to know that my sister loves you." "I do," Julian said with a certain degree of satisfaction, although she has not yet admitted it in so many words. "I'm afraid one day she'll drift away from me if I cannot find a way to stop alienating her." He turned to the younger man with a disheartened expression that Christopher, even knowing him for so little time, thought was unusual for him. He believed from Kathy's descriptions that Julian was more the type to take what he wanted and ask questions later. In fact, he assumed correctly that this was probably the heart of the problem. "There is a barrier between us," Julian went on, "although in many ways we are in complete harmony now, yet somehow she still retreats behind a wall where I can't reach her at times, and it frightens me. She is a complicated woman and difficult for some to understand. Have you observed how she notices everything? Whether it's a landscape, the intricate binding of a book, or fabric's texture? Yes, and it's extraordinary. She does this with people as well. She meets someone and understands the other person's mind within moments. I've never seen anyone like her in my life, except perhaps Robert. He understood her, Christopher. He knew what she was thinking without her having to put anything into words. He was gifted that way. While I, on the other hand, feel as if I'm struggling through a mist just to touch her at all, much less understand what constantly smolders under the surface. I only know I need her desperately, and my love for her is stronger every day. Am I on a pointless endeavor to think she really feels the same? She does feel the same. I think it's only one mistake you make with her." "A single mistake. I take false step after false step. How can you reduce all that to one mistake? You are too intense. I think it overwhelms her. She can't reach sudden conclusions. She must ponder and speculate on things a bit. And yes, before you say it, it's sometimes too much. But she is as she is, and you must be calm around her. Do not always roar and rave and leap to conclusions." Christopher smiled. As you did today, don't talk and act before you think." "Yes, as Robert's always told me." Christopher recognized the conflicted emotions his sister was feeling. He could also see that Julian's sardonic tongue probably sometimes made easy enemies, yet he had a certain self-confidence in his demeanor and a like it or not I'm here attitude that Catherine would find appealing for its strength, even as she feared it for other reasons. "If you act out dramatically, it will frighten her, or at the very least unnerve her," Christopher said, "as it did this morning." "Yes," Julian said, "and then her mind goes back to that other me, mad with grief, who always blamed her for everything and was always angry." "Exactly. That's why you must try to stifle your impulsive reactions. You must temper yourself so that she'll cease to be frightened. Then she'll come to you on her own." "On her own? She never will." "That's where you're wrong. Don't try to force what can't be forced. You will only drive her away if you pressure her. Don't take a desperate attitude. Back away and let her come to you. That is the elementary formula that will draw her to you." They came into the house, and the two men went their separate ways. Julian, still mulling over Christopher's words, was on the way to his study when he heard Rose and Janet speaking of Catherine. Suddenly his face broke into a smile, and as he realized they were merely speculating on whether they would eventually wed. Then Janet said, "It were clear she always loved them both. I've said many a time it would be one of them, villager or not, but now this tragedy makes it both in the end. It's sad, yet it be romantic." Sarah and the other servants were quick to agree and went on to the next tidbit of gossip. Julian, however, stood there silently for a moment, pondering that statement. It was clear? It certainly wasn't clear to me, although it may have merely been idle conversation for those engaged in it. For Julian, it was one of those life-altering moments one never forgets. He suddenly felt overwhelmed with this new knowledge and cursed the silly gossiping maids for seeing what was right before his eyes all along. As soon as he had taken care of business matters, he sought out his sister. "Jennifer, do you think Catherine was in love with both of us? Robert and me? I mean, from a young age, from way back when she first became aware of us at her father's shop, and chose Robert because he was obviously the better man?" "I believe she loved the two of you," Jennifer admitted. "I wouldn't say either was better or worse, though, but because she is as she is, she would have naturally been drawn to Robert when a choice had to be made. Will your next question be, do I think she's in love with you now?" "Well, what of it then?" "Of course she is, but for so long you did not see beyond her dazzling beauty to the substance underneath." "Yes," he replied. "Robert spied that instantly. I know that now. He knew she would be every bit a suitable wife, even more so than many of the women with whom people would have presumed to pair him." Julian began his old habit of pacing. "For one flaw, then, I was dismissed," he finally said, and told Jennifer what Christopher had said to him. "You were speaking, of course, of your overbearing personality," Jennifer replied, "although I think you are mistaken to call it a flaw. Our mother was the same. I remember her somewhat temperamental, a bit cynical toward life, and not always as cool-headed as our father. I suppose that's true, but I don't see why she would not be comfortable with me now. What more can I do to prove I am not a cruel person?" "She doesn't really think you're cruel. After all, she did come back to you. I think many times she mistakes strength for anger. But I was cruel to her last year, Jennifer. Then to compound her fears, this apprehension about Robert's murder, I believe she thought her father was responsible and that I would seek some revenge against her because of it. Although I'm sure in the calm light of day she must have known I'm not that wicked. But see, that's how it goes with fear. One leads to the next, and soon the person has created all kinds of imaginary scenarios that would never happen. I think you received the best advice you could from Christopher. Take what he said to heart. Although it is simple advice, I believe it is the key to all." "I shall," he replied, "but don't make the mistake of thinking my patience is genuine." Later that week, a messenger arrived with news that Bristol had been recaptured by the Parliamentarian army in September, and the Prince surrendered the city to Lord Fairfax, the new model of army's commander. Julian knew with a heavy heart what the future held, and he was more determined than ever to make Catherine his wife before the end. In the garden one day he saw her sitting alone and told her he thought it was too cold to be outdoors. Julian Bradshaw fussing over someone because she might get chilled. Who would have ever believed it? He burst out laughing and sat down next to her. He looked across the way and saw Matthew and Clarissa gathering holly and ivy and realized Catherine had come to watch them. "When did you realize you were in love with me, Kathy?" he said with no warning, picking up her hand to hold in his. He was not surprised that she did not move or show any emotion, but her answer did surprise him, as he expected only a flat denial. "The very first time?" She frowned slightly, as if looking back into the past. "That would have been when Richard was in London and Jennifer was ill. You came thundering up on Rudy and leaped down, calling to one of their servants, Curtis," she continued as if watching a play before her. "You said, 'You fool! You wait all morning for us to instead of summoning the doctor.' I can still see poor Curtis scuttling out of the garden to get Dr. Lincroft. That was years ago. I remember you and Robert were also the only ones who didn't go into hysterics because she had left her bed to sit in the garden. The whole atmosphere of the home changed. I guess we all long for the qualities we lack, and you command every situation, although you are often unaware of it. You are just being who you are. I love strength like that, the kind I could never have. No, Catherine, in truth, you are much stronger than I." People are intimidated by you, yet they perceive you will know exactly what to do. You came into the garden and knelt down to her, and your expression was so kind. You took her hands, and she said, "I've never been so sick, Julian. I'm scared." You said, "Don't fret, Jennifer. Oscar will put you to the rights. If not, he will have to answer to me." By the time Robert arrived behind you, everyone was laughing. Yes, he thought he had definitely made an impression on her that day, for that was exactly what he had said. She had both your hands in hers, and her fear had slipped away, and it was because of how you handled it all. I was fascinated with you. But another time, she finished, I know I loved you even long before that. That troubles me. It makes me feel as if I was somehow unfaithful to Robert, although I could not have loved him more than I did. Julian realized it was difficult for her to admit caring for them both. It was something deep and complicated of which he had only scratched the surface, and this was not the right time to pursue the subject, although he cursed fate that made it so. At length he said, "Well, as you once said, we were twins. It's probably not all that uncommon. Some would not care for my persona, however. You call it strength, but is it really just a determination to order the world about? I know it is somewhat unsettling to you, or terrifying," she finished. There were volumes unspoken, but which he understood. He thought about how correct Christopher was in everything he'd said. "I know I'm impossible, Kat, but you love me anyway." She lifted her shoulders. "There was no help for it," she said, "although, as you know, my love turned to hate for a short period." And at this they both laughed. "But are you happy you have admitted it now, Kat, or are you still a bit terrified?" When she didn't answer, he said, "You do love me, truly? You keep asking that, but have you ever known me to say something I don't mean?" He took her hand and kissed it. "Someone might see," she said. "I have nothing to fear from that. I will gladly tell the world that I love you. Marry me, Catherine." She was silent, and he noticed she said nothing and would not meet his eyes. "You just admitted that you love me, yet you don't answer? Please look at me," he said. And she did so. Their eyes locked, and it seemed to him as if several minutes had passed, but it couldn't have been much more than a few seconds. "I can't, Julian." "I don't understand. Surely you don't think I would mistreat you? That's not the reason, is it?" "No," she turned to him, "but let me ask you a question. And do not begin answering before I finished, but think about it. Do you honestly believe I could make you happy? Do you really think I am the wife for you? That you could be completely happy with me?" Confused, he began to speak, but she cut him off. "Oh, I wish I could be like you. You don't know how much I desire that kind of strength. The kind of inner trust in oneself that makes you utterly fearless of this world, as if you own it. Yes, people are here for whatever suits my intentions at the moment, and then discarded after the purpose is served. I could never live up to that," Catherine continued, "and you would become so bored and frustrated with me. We would come to grief. I know we would." She turned away, but not before he saw a fleeting expression of regret on her face, which in an odd way gave him hope. "What could you be talking about, sweetheart? Simply that you need someone more like yourself?" "I never heard such nonsense," he replied. "Don't you understand what attracts people in the first place? It is the difference that are intriguing, like you just admitted." "Well, it is the same for me, Catherine. I need you so desperately. I was miserable when you were gone. You bring a balance to my life, and in truth I have come to depend on it, especially since Robert's death." At this, Catherine remembered how the twins' father had said that Julian depended on Robert much more than he realized. "Believe me, Kathy, it is that mysterious quietness, that exquisite stillness that drew me in the first place. I would not want that to change. Not ever. And this notion that you are a weak person is absurd. Look what you have been through in such a short time on this earth, and you are still unchanged. You are a joy to everyone around you, selfless and peace-loving. You add much happiness to this household, as you must know. And your life has only just begun. Well, there is another thing again. I am young yet." "I am not." "After this last illness, do you want to be trapped with an invalid? I know the doctor told you that I shall die young. He tried to keep it from me, but how foolish that was. I saw my mother buried. I know why she died." "Yes, but as you said, she was most certainly helped her grave by that evil man, and she did not have proper care. You would lack for nothing. And what are you saying anyway? That I should marry someone I do not love because that person might live longer than you? He knew his words made sense because he could feel her emotions changing from her usual composure to frustration. It's too soon to think about this now. I would not want to marry you because deep down I am merely trying to replace Robert. It wouldn't be fair to you. Kathy, my love, you are not a good liar. You love me for yourself, as you have just admitted. I don't understand exactly what holds you back, but Robert would be pleased if you married me. You were as close to him as I was, and this you cannot deny. I'm not sure how I feel. Maybe it is only the love of a sister and brother after all. I see Clarissa and Matthew coming with the holly and ivy, a fact which likely pleases you. However, we are not finished speaking. Your lies grow more outrageous, but alas, I must let this rest for now. We'll talk again. With that, he quickly kissed her hand once more before the younger members of the household were upon them and made his way into the house. To get his mind off his own tumultuous romance, Julian accepted an invitation to dinner at Paul Ashington's that night on behalf of himself and the family. They were able to get news about what was happening with Cromwell's army, and after dinner he retired to the drawing room where Catherine played the lute with excellent skill. Julian took occasion to speak to Paul about the war, but then he saw Carintha pass by. Is it me, or does it seem as if Harold is drifting away ever so slightly? Paul knew exactly what he was referring to and looked thoughtful for a moment. I'm not so sure that he's drifting as much as I'm sure Lizette is pulling him. It is as I feared then. Do you think he has any true interest in Lizette? Julian asked. I think most men would be flattered if Lizette showed attention on them, but anyone searching for a suitable wife might have some hesitation. It may be a terrible thing to say about my own sister, but Carrie would make any man a better wife than Lizette. When they re-entered the drawing room, they noticed immediately that Harold was indeed sitting near Lizette, who was certainly mistress of the heart of attracting attention to herself. She was subtle, but at the same time made sure everyone in the room was aware of her. Several in the company took covert glances at Carintha, from which a sadness emanated ever so lightly, and no amount of laughter and light conversation could erase it from her expression. When Catherine finally found the scene intolerable, she waited until Harold stepped away for a moment and quietly approached Lizette. Lizette, it is obvious that Harold has some affection for Carrie, and I think the family is hoping for a match. Lizette regarded her coolly and asked why she thought that would be of any interest to her. I am not saying it would be, but it appears that if Harold has begun seeking your company, and if you are not especially fond of him, it's probably better not to encourage his affection. It may lead to hurt feelings all the way around, both his and Carintha's. I have not set out to hurt anyone's feelings, Lizette said, lifting her shoulders. I didn't say you had done anything intentionally. It's just that I think Carrie is somewhat unhappy, since Harold was clearly interested in her before. You must know he's becoming infatuated with you. Which cannot be blamed on me. No, Catherine answered, but Carintha would not compete for a man's attention, and then is it not her fault if he moves on? Lizette replied scornfully, but with a smile. I don't think that's what I meant. Men are not possessions to be fought over. You are simple and unworldly, aren't you? Lizette replied, making Catherine wonder if someone had told her this. You are trying to win Harold Montgomery, then. You never seemed interested in him before. I always go for the top conquest. He is hardly that. A second son of one of the smaller estates? Lizette replied in disdain. Then why not leave him to Carrie? Catherine asked, bewildered. Perhaps I will, Lizette replied, sauntering away. Catherine was very uneasy, but realized there was nothing she could do.